The elite Vanderbilt family hired Sarah Johnson, believing her to be a simple, uneducated nanny for their difficult daughter, and treated her with dismissive condescension. But as they did, a quiet miracle unfolded. Their child began to blossom, suddenly quoting scientific principles and displaying an astonishing emotional intelligence. This inexplicable transformation revealed that their unassuming nanny was harboring a profound secret, forcing the Vanderbilts to confront whether the woman they'd so thoroughly misjudged was a gift to their family, or the brilliant architect of their downfall. If you liked the video and subscribe to the channel, let's move on to our story. Enjoy watching. The Vanderbilts lived in a world of polished marble and hushed tones, a world where the sun seemed to shine a little brighter on their manicured lawns. Their Georgian-style mansion, a formidable edifice of brick and ivy, stood as a testament to generations of old money and unspoken influence. Richard Vanderbilt, a man whose tailored suits were as sharp as his business acumen, and his wife, Eleanor, a woman who wore her philanthropy like a second skin, were the current custodians of this legacy. And at the heart of their pristine world was their 3-year-old daughter, Lily, a whirlwind of untapped energy and unbridled curiosity. It was this whirlwind that had necessitated the urgent hiring of a new nanny. The previous one, a prim and proper Englishwoman with a string of qualifications, had lasted a mere 2 months, worn down by Lily's spirited defiance. The agency, scrambling to fill the position, had sent over a candidate who, on paper, seemed a far cry from their usual placements. Her name was Sarah Johnson, and her resume was, in Eleanor's words, conspicuously brief. Sarah arrived on a Tuesday, the sky a brilliant, unapologetic blue. She stood at the imposing front door, a simple canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder, her presence a stark contrast to the grandeur that surrounded her. The butler, a man whose posture was as starched as his collar, led her through the cavernous foyer, his footsteps echoing on the black and white checkered marble. Eleanor Vanderbilt descended the grand staircase, a vision in cream-colored cashmere. She greeted Sarah with a smile that was both polite and dismissive, her eyes performing a swift, critical appraisal. "Sarah, is it? Thank you for coming on such short notice." Her voice was light and airy, yet carried an unmistakable undertone of authority. "It's my pleasure, Mrs. Vanderbilt," Sarah replied, her voice calm and steady, a quiet pool in the midst of the mansion's opulence. Richard Vanderbilt emerged from his study, a formidable presence with a handshake that was firm and brief. "We're in a bit of a bind here, Sarah," he said, his tone suggesting that this was an inconvenience he was unaccustomed to. "Our Lily, she's a handful." "I understand," Sarah said, her gaze unwavering. "I'm confident I can be of assistance." The Vanderbilts exchanged a look, a fleeting, almost imperceptible glance that spoke volumes. It was a look that communicated their shared skepticism, their unspoken agreement that this woman, with her simple dress and unassuming demeanor, was a temporary solution at best. "Well," Eleanor said, her voice a little too bright, "let's not waste any more time. Lily is in the playroom." The playroom was a child's paradise, a wonderland of expensive toys and custom-made furniture. And in the center of it all was Lily, a tiny tempest in a pink tutu, her face a mask of frustration as she struggled to build a tower of blocks that kept toppling over. "Lily, darling," Eleanor cooed, "this is Sarah. She's going to be helping us out for a while." Lily glanced at Sarah, her lower lip trembling, her eyes welling up with tears. "It won't work," she wailed, kicking at the pile of blocks. Sarah didn't say a word. She simply walked over to the blocks, her movements unhurried and deliberate. She sat on the floor, not with the stiff awkwardness of an adult, but with a natural ease that was both surprising and disarming. She picked up 2 blocks and, with a gentle click, connected them. Then she looked at Lily, a silent invitation in her eyes. Lily sniffled, her curiosity piqued. She crawled over to Sarah and, with a hesitant hand, picked up another block. Sarah guided her, her touch light and reassuring. Together they began to build, not a tower, but a sprawling, imaginative castle, its turrets and bridges a testament to their newfound collaboration. Eleanor and Richard watched from the doorway, their expressions a mixture of surprise and grudging approval. "Well, I'll be," Richard muttered, a sentiment that Eleanor echoed with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Later that evening, as they sat in their drawing room, a cavernous space filled with the scent of old leather and expensive perfume, the Vanderbilts discussed their new nanny. "She's different," Eleanor said, swirling the wine in her glass. A bit rough around the edges, don't you think? She's certainly not what we're used to, Richard agreed. But Lily seems to have taken to her. And for now, that's all that matters. I suppose, Eleanor conceded, though her tone was laced with a hint of condescension. I just hope she's up to the task. I'd hate for Lily's development to suffer. Don't worry, my dear, Richard said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. We'll keep a close eye on things. And if she's not a good fit, we'll simply find someone else. It's not as if she's irreplaceable. Upstairs, in the soft glow of the nursery lamp, Sarah was reading to Lily, her voice a soothing melody that filled the room. The story was a simple one, a tale of a brave little firefly who wasn't afraid of the dark. But in Sarah's telling, it became a grand adventure, a symphony of words that held Lily spellbound. As she finished the last page, she looked down at the small sleeping form in the crib, her heart filled with a quiet, fierce protectiveness. She knew what the Vanderbilts thought of her, had seen it in their eyes, heard it in their carefully chosen words. They saw her as a temporary fix, an uneducated woman who was lucky to be in their employ. But they didn't see the whole picture. They didn't see the years of study, the passion for child development, the unwavering belief in the power of early education. They didn't see the master's degree in child psychology, the thesis on the importance of play-based learning, the years of experience working with children from all walks of life. They saw what they wanted to see, a stereotype, a caricature. But Sarah wasn't there to prove them wrong. She was there for Lily. And as she watched the gentle rise and fall of the child's chest, she knew that this was where she was meant to be. The Vanderbilts may have hired a nanny, but they had unknowingly welcomed a quiet revolution into their home, a revolution that would challenge their preconceived notions and change their lives in ways they could never have imagined. The first seeds of that revolution had been sown, and in the fertile ground of a child's mind, they were already beginning to take root. The first week bled into the second, and a new rhythm began to establish itself within the Vanderbilt mansion, a rhythm so subtle that Richard and Eleanor initially failed to notice its steady, transformative beat. The mornings, once a frantic scramble of misplaced shoes and tearful refusals to eat breakfast, were now imbued with an unfamiliar sense of calm. Lily, who had previously treated getting dressed as a form of mortal combat, now laid out her own clothes, a small triumphant smile on her face as she navigated buttons and zippers. Sarah had turned the mundane task into a game, a daily mission where Agent Lily had to prepare for her assignment in the playroom. Eleanor observed these changes with a detached curiosity. She seems more compliant, she remarked to Richard one morning over coffee, as if discussing a recent stock acquisition. It's a pleasant surprise. Perhaps she was just going through a phase. Richard, hidden behind the Wall Street Journal, grunted in agreement. Good. All that fuss for nothing. See, the problem sorted itself out. But the problem hadn't simply sorted itself out. It had been meticulously, lovingly, and intelligently dismantled by Sarah. She operated not with the rigid authority of her predecessors, but with the quiet wisdom of a skilled educator. She saw Lily not as a vessel to be filled with rules, but as a mind to be ignited. Their days were a tapestry of exploration, woven with threads of science, art, and language, all disguised as play. A trip to the meticulously kept garden was no longer just a walk, it was a botanical expedition. Sarah and Lily would collect leaves not just to press them in a book, but to analyze their intricate vein patterns, their varied textures, their shades of green and gold. Sarah would use words like serrated and lobed, not in a pedantic, instructive tone, but with the natural enthusiasm of a fellow explorer. Look, Lily, she'd say, her voice full of wonder, this maple leaf looks like a star with 5 points. Soon Lily was chattering about the waxy magnolia leaves and the delicate fern fronds, her vocabulary expanding at a breathtaking pace. In the afternoons, the playroom became a laboratory. While previous nannies had focused on keeping the expensive toys in pristine condition, Sarah encouraged mess and experimentation. They built elaborate structures with magnetic tiles, learning about balance and gravity. They created potions in the art sink, mixing primary colored water to discover the magic of orange, green, and purple. Sarah introduced the concept of measurement, using small plastic beakers and spoons, her commentary a simple, running narrative of cause and effect. What do you think will happen if we add a little more blue? She'd ask, her questions always open-ended, always valuing Lily's hypothesis. The change in Lily's emotional landscape was perhaps the most profound. Her tantrums, once volcanic and unpredictable, became fewer and farther between. When frustration did bubble to the surface, Sarah didn't dismiss it. She would get down on Lily's level, her expression one of genuine empathy. "I can see you're feeling very frustrated that the tower fell down," she would say, giving a name to the overwhelming emotion. She created a cozy corner in the playroom, filled with soft pillows and picture books, a safe haven where Lily could go to feel her feelings without judgment. She taught her a game called Dragon Breaths, a playful way of taking deep, calming breaths when she felt overwhelmed. The Vanderbilts, caught in the whirlwind of their own social and professional lives, saw only the surface of these changes. They noticed Lily was less prone to outbursts, but attributed it to her maturing. They heard her use a new, surprisingly complex word at the dinner table and exchanged a brief, amused glance, as if it were a charming party trick. One evening, Eleanor was hosting a small, impromptu gathering for some of her friends from the museum board. She called for Lily to be brought down to say goodnight, a customary performance for her guests. As Lily entered the drawing room, one of Eleanor's friends, a woman named Beatrice who considered herself a connoisseur of child-rearing, knelt down. "And who is this beautiful little princess?" Beatrice asked in a saccharine, high-pitched voice. Instead of the shy mumble Eleanor expected, Lily stood tall and replied, "I'm not a princess. I'm a paleontologist." She then pointed to the fossil of an ammonite that served as a decorative bookend on a nearby shelf. "And that is an extinct cephalopod from the Cretaceous period." A stunned silence fell over the room, broken only by Beatrice's nervous titter. Eleanor felt a flush of pride, quickly followed by a wave of confusion. Where on earth had she learned that? She glanced towards the doorway where Sarah stood, a quiet, unassuming presence. She caught Sarah's eye and for a fleeting moment, saw a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, pride perhaps or amusement. Eleanor quickly looked away, a vague, unsettling feeling creeping into her consciousness. "What a clever girl," Beatrice finally managed to say, patting Lily's head. "Sarah and I have been reading about dinosaurs," Lily explained matter-of-factly. "They're fascinating." Later that night, after the guests had departed, Eleanor found herself pacing in her bedroom. "Richard, did you hear Lily earlier? The dinosaur thing?" "Yes, quite a mouthful. Must have picked it up from one of those television shows," he said, loosening his tie. "I don't think so," Eleanor said slowly, her brow furrowed. "We don't let her watch those kinds of shows. Sarah reads to her." She paused, the pieces beginning to form a picture she wasn't quite ready to accept. "Richard, do you think it's possible that Sarah is more than she appears?" Richard laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Eleanor, darling, don't be ridiculous. She's a nanny. A perfectly adequate one it seems, but let's not get carried away. She's simply good with children. We got lucky. Now let's not overthink it. The important thing is, Lily is happy and our lives are easier." Eleanor allowed herself to be persuaded, pushing the unsettling thoughts aside. It was easier to believe they had simply gotten lucky than to confront the alternative, that they had fundamentally misjudged the woman they had entrusted with their child, and that the quiet transformation happening under their own roof had a source they had willfully, arrogantly refused to see. The incident with the cephalopod was not an isolated event. It was merely the first tremor in what was becoming a seismic shift in Lily's cognitive landscape. A few weeks later, Richard was attempting to assemble a new, ridiculously complex piece of Scandinavian furniture for his study. He was surrounded by a sea of wooden dowels, cryptic diagrams, and a growing cloud of frustration. Lily, who had wandered in with Sarah, watched him for a moment, her head tilted. "Daddy," she said, pointing a small finger at the diagram, "that piece is rotated incorrectly. The holes won't align with the corresponding pegs if you keep it in that orientation." Richard froze, his hand hovering over a misplaced screw. He stared at his daughter, then at the diagram, then back at his daughter. She was right. He had been trying to force the piece in upside down. He looked up at Sarah, who was standing quietly by the door, her expression neutral. "Orientation? Corresponding pegs?" he repeated, bewildered. "We've been working on spatial reasoning puzzles," Sarah offered simply. "Lily is very good at visualizing how shapes fit together." She then gently guided Lily out of the room, leaving Richard sitting amidst the wreckage of his project, a strange feeling of obsolescence washing over him. He was the master of the boardroom, a man who navigated multi-million-dollar deals with cold precision, yet he had just been outsmarted by a 3-year-old and a diagram. The true reckoning, however, came during the parent-teacher conference at Lily's exclusive preschool. The Vanderbilts sat on child-sized chairs in a classroom that smelled of tempera paint and disinfectant, facing a young, earnest teacher named Ms. Albright. They had expected the usual platitudes, that Lily was a delight and was adjusting well. Instead, Ms. Albright opened a folder and looked at them with an expression of sheer, unadulterated awe. "Mr. and Mrs. Vanderbilt," she began, her voice brimming with excitement, "I've been teaching for 10 years, and I have never seen a developmental leap quite like Lily's. Her pre-literacy skills are astounding. She's not just recognizing letters, she's demonstrating phonemic awareness. She can isolate initial and final sounds in words, which is a skill we typically don't see until kindergarten, if not later." Eleanor smiled, a tight, practiced gesture. "She's always been a bright child." "It's more than just brightness," Ms. Albright insisted, leaning forward. "It's the conceptual understanding. We were doing a simple sorting activity with shapes, and Lily began grouping them not just by color or shape, but by the number of vertices. And her conflict resolution skills. The other day 2 boys were arguing over a toy truck. Lily approached them and said, 'Let's formulate a plan for equitable turn-taking.' I nearly fell over." She beamed at them. "Whatever enrichment you're doing at home, it is working wonders. The scaffolding you're providing for her learning is textbook perfect." The words, phonemic awareness, vertices, scaffolding, hung in the air, foreign and slightly accusatory. Eleanor felt a prickle of unease. She and Richard were providing nothing of the sort. Their evenings were spent at charity galas and board meetings, not formulating plans for equitable turn-taking. Driving home in their silent, air-conditioned Mercedes, the tension was palpable. Richard, ever the pragmatist, was the first to speak. "Well, that's good news. Proves she's a Vanderbilt through and through. Smart as a whip." "Did you understand what she was talking about?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Scaffolding? Vertices. Corporate buzzwords, Eleanor. They've invaded the education system," he scoffed, though his confidence sounded hollow. "The point is, our daughter is excelling. We're paying for the best and we're getting the best." But Eleanor knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they weren't the ones providing it. The enrichment Ms. Albright had praised was not coming from them. It was coming from Sarah. The realization was deeply unsettling, a crack in the foundation of her carefully constructed world. It suggested that she, Eleanor Vanderbilt, with all her resources and connections, was failing at the one thing that was supposed to be innate: motherhood. And worse, the person succeeding where she had failed was the woman she had dismissed as simple and uneducated. That evening, driven by a mixture of jealousy and a desperate need for answers, Eleanor came home early. She let herself in quietly, her heels silent on the plush runners. She crept up the stairs towards the playroom, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She expected to hear the mindless chatter of a child at play. Instead, she heard Sarah's calm, clear voice. "Okay, so we have 12 apple slices. If you and I want to share them equally, how many will each of us get?" 6. Lily's voice chirped. "Exactly. Because 6 is half of 12. We've just done division." Eleanor peered through the crack in the door. Sarah and Lily were sitting on the floor, a plate of apple slices between them. They weren't just eating a snack, they were engaged in a hands-on math lesson. On the easel behind them was a large sheet of paper where they had painted a butterfly. Sarah was pointing to its wings. "And see how this side is a mirror image of that side. That's called symmetry." It was all there. The scaffolding, the enrichment, the vocabulary. It was intentional, brilliant, and completely disguised as fun. Later, as Sarah was preparing Lily's bath, Eleanor cornered her in the hallway. She struggled to keep her tone casual, but her voice was strained. "Sarah, Ms. Albright was telling us how much Lily is learning. These games you play with her, they're quite effective." Sarah turned, her hands still damp. "Lily is a very curious child, Mrs. Vanderbilt. It's easy to teach someone who wants to learn." "Yes, but the things you're teaching, division, symmetry?" Eleanor let the words hang in the air, an unspoken question. "Who are you? Where did you learn to do all that?" Sarah's expression didn't change. She simply met Eleanor's gaze with that same unnerving calm. "You can find a lesson in almost anything if you look for it." She offered a small, polite smile. "Now if you'll excuse me, the bathwater will get cold." She turned and walked into the bathroom, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the hallway, the scent of lavender soap wafting behind her. The simple, unassuming answer was more disarming than any grand confession. It gave away nothing, and yet, in its quiet confidence, it confirmed everything. Eleanor walked into her own bedroom and stared at the collection of parenting books on her nightstand, their glossy covers promising secrets she had never bothered to unlock. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Vanderbilt felt profoundly and utterly inadequate. The evidence was irrefutable, and it pointed to a truth she was not yet ready to face. The annual Vanderbilt family garden party was less a celebration and more a strategic display of status. It was an afternoon of crisp white linens, champagne that fizzed with quiet importance, and conversations as carefully manicured as the prize-winning roses. For Eleanor, it was the apex of the social season, a high-stakes performance where every detail, from the placement of the string quartet to the chill on the shrimp cocktail, had to be flawless. This year, a new, unpredictable variable had been introduced: Sarah. Eleanor had given her instructions with a clipped, nervous energy. "Lily is to make an appearance at precisely 3 o'clock, she had commanded, adjusting a stray curl in the mirror. "Her dress is laid out. I want her hair in a French braid. And Sarah," she had added, turning to face her, "please try to be unobtrusive. Mingle with the other staff if you must. Just keep Lily occupied and away from the guests until it's time." The implication was clear. Sarah was a prop, a necessary but unsightly piece of backstage equipment. The guests began to arrive, a flock of expensively plumed birds of prey, their laughter sharp and their gazes sharper. Among them was Richard's older brother, Wallace, a man whose booming voice and ruddy complexion seemed to take up more space than he was physically entitled to. His wife, Patricia, a woman so thin she looked as if she might snap in a strong breeze, trailed in his wake, her eyes darting around, cataloging every perceived flaw. Sarah, having expertly braided Lily's hair, watched from an upper window as the party unfolded. She felt a familiar sense of detachment, the anthropologist observing a strange and baffling tribe. At 3 o'clock, she took Lily's hand and they descended into the fray. The effect was immediate. As they moved through the sea of pastel-colored silks and seersucker suits, conversations lulled. Heads turned. Sarah felt the collective gaze of the Vanderbilt clan upon her, a heavy, suffocating blanket of judgment. Patricia was the first to approach, her smile a slash of coral lipstick. "Oh, Eleanor, there you are," she exclaimed, her eyes fixed on Sarah. "And this must be the new girl. What a lifesaver you must be." She didn't address Sarah directly, instead speaking about her as if she were a new appliance. "This is Sarah," Eleanor said, her voice tight. "And this is my niece, Lily." "Hello," Lily said, her voice clear and confident. Wallace lumbered over, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked Sarah up and down, a slow, insolent appraisal. Well, he boomed. "Richard didn't tell me the agency was diversifying. Good for them." He winked, a gesture that was both lecherous and demeaning. Sarah felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach, but her expression remained serene. She gave a slight, non-committal nod. She had weathered this kind of casual bigotry before. It was a storm she knew how to stand in without flinching. "And you're so articulate," Patricia added, her tone one of profound surprise, as if she had just witnessed a dog recite Shakespeare. "Where did they find you?" Before Sarah could answer, Lily piped up. "Sarah is from Philadelphia. She has a whole library in her room. We're reading about the life cycle of stars. It's called stellar evolution." A brief, awkward silence descended. Wallace cleared his throat. "Stellar what now? Don't you go filling her head with nonsense, girl. A woman's place is in the home, not in the cosmos." He chuckled at his own joke, a harsh, grating sound. The microaggressions continued, a steady, relentless downpour. A cousin mistook her for a caterer and tried to hand her a dirty plate. An aunt asked her if she had many siblings, her question loaded with assumptions about her family life. Through it all, Sarah maintained her quiet dignity, her composure a silent rebuke to their ignorance. She was there to do a job, and that job was to care for Lily. The breaking point came when Wallace, having drained his whiskey, caught Sarah's eye from across the lawn. He crooked his finger, a gesture one might use to summon a dog. "You," he bellowed, his voice carrying across the manicured lawn. "Be a good girl and fetch me another one of these. And don't be stingy with the ice." The string quartet seemed to falter. All eyes turned to Sarah. Eleanor looked as if she wanted the ground to swallow her whole. This was the scene she had dreaded, the crack in her perfect facade. She started to move forward, to placate Wallace, to smooth over the horrifying social faux pas. But Lily was faster. She dropped Sarah's hand, marched right up to her great-uncle, and planted her small hands on her hips. Her face was a thundercloud of indignation. "Her name is Sarah," she said, her voice ringing out with astonishing clarity. "And she is not a good girl. She is my teacher. And you should say please. It's called being polite." The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if a bomb had gone off, shattering the fragile artifice of the party. Wallace's face turned a shade of purple that clashed violently with his pink polo shirt. Patricia looked as if she might faint. Richard and Eleanor rushed forward in a flurry of damage control. "Wallace, she's just a child, she doesn't understand," Richard stammered, trying to laugh it off. "Come Lily, let's go find you a cookie," Eleanor said, her hand a claw on her daughter's shoulder, pulling her away from the scene of the crime. She shot Sarah a look of pure venom, a look that said, "This is your fault." Sarah stood frozen for a moment, the unwilling epicenter of the earthquake. Then, with a quiet grace that was in itself an act of defiance, she turned and followed Eleanor and Lily, leaving the Vanderbilt clan to reassemble the shattered pieces of their afternoon. Upstairs, in the sanctuary of the nursery, the recriminations began. "I have never been so mortified in my entire life," Eleanor hissed, her voice a low, trembling fury. She was pacing back and forth, her hands clenched at her sides. She didn't yell at Lily. She directed all of her anger at Sarah. "What did you say to her? Why would she cause a scene like that? Your job is to manage her, to keep things running smoothly." "I didn't say anything, Mrs. Vanderbilt," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Lily was simply reacting to what she saw. What she saw was a guest making a simple request. Eleanor shot back, her denial a shield against the ugly truth. "You need to be more discreet. You need to blend in. This cannot happen again." The injustice of it was breathtaking. Sarah had been publicly humiliated, and now she was being reprimanded for it. But as she looked at Eleanor's frantic, desperate face, she didn't feel anger. She felt a profound sense of pity. Eleanor wasn't just defending her brother-in-law's boorish behavior. She was defending the entire rotten structure on which her world was built. Later, after a tearful Lily had been calmed and put to bed, Sarah sat in her own small room, the sounds of the party a distant, muffled hum. The sting of Wallace's words, of Patricia's condescension, of Eleanor's misplaced blame, was real. But stronger than the sting was a fierce, burning clarity. Her purpose here was more vital than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just about teaching Lily phonics and division. It was about arming her with empathy, with courage, with a moral compass strong enough to navigate the toxic currents of her own family. The battle had been joined, not on the manicured lawn below, but in the heart of a little girl who had stood up for what was right. And in that battle, Sarah knew, they had just won a major victory. The garden party left a permanent scar on the Vanderbilts' pristine social facade. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the mansion was thick with unspoken resentments. Eleanor moved through the halls like a ghost, her usual crisp efficiency replaced by a distracted, nervous energy. The incident had been a profound humiliation, not just because of Wallace's boorishness, but because of Lily's shocking, unprecedented defiance. To Eleanor, it was a public indictment of her parenting, a glaring spotlight on her loss of control. And at the center of it all was Sarah. Eleanor's conversations with Richard became clipped and fraught with tension. "We have to do something about her," she insisted one evening, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "She's putting ideas in Lily's head." "Her name is Sarah," she mimicked, her tone laced with a bitter sort of awe. "A 3-year-old doesn't come up with that on her own." Richard, however, remained stubbornly obtuse, retreating behind a wall of patriarchal condescension. "Eleanor, you're being hysterical," he said, not looking up from a financial report. "It was embarrassing, I'll grant you, but it's over." Lily was defending her nanny. "It shows loyalty. A good trait. Wallace was out of line and had too much to drink. End of story." "It is not the end of story." Eleanor snapped, her voice rising. This is about more than Wallace. It's about this woman, this stranger, who is fundamentally changing our child in ways we don't understand. We know nothing about her. We know she's good at her job, Richard countered, finally looking at her. Lily is happy, she's learning, and our lives are manageable. For God's sake, Eleanor, can't you just accept that we got lucky? Must you dissect everything until it's ruined? His dismissal was a spark on dry tinder. If her husband wouldn't take her concerns seriously, she would take matters into her own hands. The next morning, after Richard had left for the city and Sarah had taken Lily to the park, Eleanor went into Sarah's room. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of guilt and justification. This was a gross violation of privacy, but it was necessary. She was a mother protecting her family. The room was Spartan, almost monastic. A neatly made bed, a small, worn armchair, and a simple wooden desk. And on that desk, a stack of books. Eleanor's eyes scanned the titles, expecting to find romance novels or celebrity magazines. Instead, she saw The Absorbent Mind by Maria Montessori, The 100 Languages of Children from the Educators of Reggio Emilia, and Mind and Society by Lev Vygotsky. They were dense, academic texts on child development and educational theory. Tucked inside one of them was a thin, leather-bound journal. With trembling hands, Eleanor opened it. Sarah's handwriting was a series of neat, precise loops. It wasn't a diary of personal feelings, but a logbook of observations. October 12th. Lily demonstrated a strong interest in cause and effect today. Introduced the concept of a Rube Goldberg machine using her toy train tracks and blocks. She remained engaged for 45 minutes, a significant increase in her attention span. Hypothesis: complex, multi-step problem solving is highly motivating for her. October 15th. Noticed Lily's frustration with fine motor tasks, buttoning her coat. Created a dexterity station with lacing cards, nuts and bolts, and modeling clay. The focus is on process, not product, to build resilience and reduce anxiety around perfection. October 19th. The garden party. Wallace's behavior was a teachable moment, albeit a difficult one. Lily's response was instinctual, a defense of fairness. This is a critical juncture. It's vital to reinforce the idea that respect is universal and not dependent on status or position. We will read Amazing Grace tomorrow and discuss why it's wrong to judge people before you know them. Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed, the journal heavy in her lap. This wasn't the diary of a simple nanny. It was the field notes of a highly trained professional. The language, the methodology, the sheer intentionality of it all was staggering. The words from the preschool conference, scaffolding, enrichment, came rushing back, no longer abstract jargon but a clear, deliberate strategy outlined in these pages. She felt a dizzying mix of emotions: awe at Sarah's brilliance, shame at her own ignorance, and a sharp, bitter pang of jealousy. Sarah wasn't just caring for Lily, she was cultivating her, nurturing her mind with a skill and dedication that Eleanor had never even thought to attempt. Her investigation didn't stop there. Fueled by this new, terrifying understanding, she went to her study and turned on her computer. She had the agency's file, but it had been, as she'd noted, conspicuously brief. It listed a community college and a handful of short-term nanny placements. It was a resume designed to be overlooked, to be underestimated. Eleanor now suspected it was a fabrication. She started with a simple search: Sarah Johnson, Philadelphia, child development. The results were a meaningless flood. She narrowed it, adding Vygotsky, Reggio Emilia. Nothing. She was about to give up when a new thought struck her. What if Sarah wasn't her real name? It was a common enough name to be an alias. But what was her real name? She had no way of knowing. Defeated, she leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. She thought back to the garden party, to the way Sarah had stood her ground with such quiet, unshakable dignity. There was a confidence there, a self-possession that was at odds with the role she was supposed to be playing. Her eyes fell on the name of the agency that had placed Sarah. It was a high-end, exclusive service they had used for years. She picked up the phone and dialed, her resolve hardening. She was Eleanor Vanderbilt. She would get answers. "Good morning, this is Eleanor Vanderbilt," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. "I'm calling about the nanny you placed with us, Sarah Johnson. I seem to have misplaced her full file, and I need to review her references for our household insurance." It was a lie, but a plausible one. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the clicking of a keyboard. "Of course, Mrs. Vanderbilt. Let me pull that up for you. Sarah Johnson, yes, here she is." The agent hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was long enough for Eleanor to notice. "I'm sending the file over to your email now. Is there anything else?" "One more thing," Eleanor said, her heart beginning to pound again. "Her academic transcripts. I don't seem to have a copy of those." Another pause, this one longer. "That's unusual, Mrs. Vanderbilt. Our nannies are not required to provide full transcripts. Her qualifications are listed in the summary." "I insist," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to an icy calm. "For our records." The agent capitulated, her voice flustered. "Of course. I'll see what I can do. I'll have to get approval from our director." An hour later, an email arrived. It contained the same sparse resume she had seen before. But attached was a second, password-protected PDF. The password was in the body of the email, Vanderbilt. With a trembling finger, she clicked it open. The document that appeared on her screen was not from a community college. It was a transcript from the University of Pennsylvania, one of the top universities in the country. And the name at the top was not Sarah Johnson. It was Dr. Sarah N. Adebayo. Below the name was a list of achievements that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. Bachelor of Arts in Psychology, summa cum laude. Master of Science in Education. And finally, Doctor of Philosophy in Human Development and Quantitative Methods. The title of her doctoral dissertation was listed at the bottom. The Pedagogy of Play, Scaffolding Executive Function in Early Childhood Through Emergent Curriculum. Eleanor stared at the screen, the words blurring together. Dr. Sarah Adebayo. A PhD. An expert, a scholar, a woman at the absolute top of her field. And she was in their home, cleaning up spilled juice and reading bedtime stories. The woman they had treated as a menial servant, the woman her brother-in-law had tried to order around like a dog, was more qualified, more educated, and more brilliant than any of them. The quiet revolution had a name, and Eleanor Vanderbilt had just discovered the identity of its leader. The discovery of Dr. Sarah N. Adebayo's true identity did not bring Eleanor the vindication she had sought. Instead, it plunged her into a state of profound and disorienting cognitive dissonance. The world, which had always been a simple, neatly ordered hierarchy with the Vanderbilts perched comfortably at the top, had been turned upside down. The woman she had dismissed as rough around the edges was, in fact, an intellectual heavyweight, a scholar whose credentials dwarfed her own. The shame was a physical sensation, a hot, creeping flush that seemed to permanently stain her cheeks. Her behavior towards Sarah underwent a bizarre and immediate transformation. The clipped commands and condescending pronouncements vanished, replaced by a stilted, excruciatingly awkward politeness. The morning after her discovery, Eleanor found Sarah in the kitchen making coffee. "Good morning, Sarah," Eleanor said, her voice unnaturally high. Can I get that for you?" Sarah turned, a flicker of surprise in her eyes at the offer. "I can manage, Mrs. Vanderbilt, thank you." "Please," Eleanor insisted, practically lunging for the coffee pot. "You have your hands full with Lily. It's the least I can do." She fumbled with the machine, her movements clumsy and uncertain, as if she were a tourist attempting to navigate a foreign land. She, who had never prepared a cup of coffee in her own home, was now serving the nanny. The absurdity of the situation was lost on no one. The changes were small but seismic. Eleanor started calling her Sarah, instead of the nanny, when speaking to Richard. She began asking questions about Lily's day, not with the detached air of a supervisor, but with the hesitant curiosity of a student. What sort of emergent curriculum did you explore today?" she asked one afternoon, stumbling over the term she had read in the dissertation title. Sarah, who was helping Lily paint a watercolor of the garden, didn't miss a beat. "Lily was curious about why the leaves are changing color," she replied calmly, her gaze steady. "So, we've been learning about chlorophyll and photosynthesis. We're making a visual representation of the process." She gestured to the painting, a vibrant swirl of greens, yellows, and reds. It was a simple answer, yet it was a masterclass in pedagogy, delivered without a hint of condescension. Each interaction became a minefield for Eleanor, each of Sarah's simple, direct answers a fresh reminder of the chasm between them. That evening, Eleanor confronted Richard. She cornered him in his study, holding the printed transcript like a smoking gun. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and awe. "About Sarah." Richard waved a dismissive hand. "Eleanor, I thought we were past this. She's a good nanny. Let it be." "She's not a nanny, Richard," Eleanor said, slapping the papers down on his mahogany desk. "She's a doctor." Richard picked up the transcript, his brow furrowed in annoyance. As he read, his expression shifted from irritation to disbelief, and finally to a look of stunned, almost comical, bewilderment. He looked at the name, then at the qualifications, then back at the name. "A PhD? From Penn? You've got to be kidding me." "Her name isn't even Sarah Johnson," Eleanor continued, pacing the room. "It's Adebayo. Dr. Sarah Adebayo. The agency, her resume, it was all a front." Richard leaned back in his chair, a slow, calculating look entering his eyes. The initial shock was already being processed, filed away, and reframed through the lens of a ruthless businessman. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. He wasn't embarrassed, he was impressed. "A PhD in child development. We didn't just get lucky, Eleanor. We hit the jackpot." "The jackpot?" Eleanor stared at him aghast. "Richard, do you understand what this means? The way we've treated her. The way Wallace treated her. It's horrifying." "It's business," he countered, his voice regaining its familiar, authoritative tone. "She chose to operate under a pseudonym. She knew what she was signing up for. And frankly, we're getting an Ivy League education for our daughter at a nanny salary. It's the best investment we've ever made." He tapped the transcript with his finger. "This explains everything. Lily's vocabulary, her confidence, the equitable turn-taking. We haven't hired a nanny, we've hired a private, one-on-one academic prodigy." His reaction was, in its own way, more galling than her own. He felt no shame, only a smug sense of having secured a bargain. The revelation didn't prompt him to treat Sarah with more respect. It simply increased her value as an asset. Sarah, for her part, was acutely aware of the shift. She noticed Eleanor's flustered attempts at courtesy, her sudden, intense interest in pedagogical theory. She saw the way Richard now looked at her, a new, appraising glint in his eye, as if he were admiring a prized racehorse. She knew they had discovered her secret. The air in the house grew thick with the unspoken truth, a constant, low-level hum of tension. She didn't change her behavior. She remained the same calm, consistent, and nurturing presence in Lily's life. Her work was her focus. But she began to prepare herself for the inevitable confrontation. She knew it was only a matter of time before the Vanderbilts decided to address the elephant in the room. The charade continued for another week, a silent, awkward dance of avoidance. Eleanor would ask Sarah about her day, her questions laced with a new, deferential tone. Richard would make comments at dinner like, "Lily, tell me about the scientific principles you and Doctor." He would catch himself. "You and Sarah discussed today." The unspoken knowledge hung between them, suffocating and immense. It was a power shift, silent but absolute. The Vanderbilts had always believed that their money and status gave them the upper hand. But they were slowly, painfully coming to realize that true power lay not in wealth, but in knowledge. And in their home, the most powerful person was the one they had tried their hardest to look down on. The quiet revolution was no longer a secret, and the anticipation of the coming storm was more deafening than any shout. The summons came on a Tuesday evening. Lily was asleep, the house was silent, and the unspoken tension had finally reached its breaking point. "Sarah," Richard had said, his voice stiff and formal as he met her in the upstairs hallway. "Could you please join my wife and me in the study? We feel it's time we cleared the air." Sarah followed him down the grand staircase, her footsteps silent on the thick Persian runner. She felt a strange sense of calm, the quiet that comes after a long-anticipated storm has finally gathered. The study door clicked shut behind her, a sound of finality. Eleanor was standing by the fireplace, her arms crossed tightly, while Richard took his place behind the formidable mahogany desk. He had arranged the scene like a boardroom execution. Between them, lying starkly on the polished wood, was the transcript. Dr. Sarah N. Adebayo. "Sarah," Richard began, his tone that of a CEO addressing a subordinate who had violated company policy. "Or perhaps I should say Dr. Adebayo. It has come to our attention that you have been working for us under false pretenses." Sarah met his gaze without blinking. I have been working for you as a nanny for your daughter, Lily. That has always been true. Don't play games with us, he said, his voice hardening. He tapped a finger on the transcript. This document says you have a doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania. It says you are a leading expert in your field. Your resume, the one you provided to the agency, lists a community college. That is a material misrepresentation. It was a necessary one, Sarah replied, her voice even and calm. Eleanor, unable to remain silent any longer, pushed herself away from the fireplace. Her voice was raw, frayed with a week of sleepless nights and churning emotions. Why, she asked, the single word a plea. Why would you do this? Why would you lie? Sarah finally turned her full attention to Eleanor, and for the first time she allowed a hint of her own story to enter her voice. I didn't lie about the work, Mrs. Vanderbilt. I lied about the qualifications because it was the only way to get the job I wanted. She paused, letting the silence hang in the air before continuing. I spent years in academia, in research. I wrote papers, I attended conferences, I debated theory. But I was becoming more and more removed from the one thing that mattered, the children. I wanted to be on the ground, in a home, applying my research in a real-world environment. I wanted to work directly with one child over a long period, to see what was truly possible. But with your credentials. Eleanor began, her voice trailing off. With my credentials, Sarah finished for her, the agencies would have offered me a position as a family consultant or an educational director. They would have had me creating curriculums for a team of nannies, managing staff and writing reports. They would never have placed me in a hands-on role, changing diapers and building block towers. To them, it would have been a waste of my talent. To me, it's where the most important work is done. Richard leaned forward, his businessman's mind trying to find a logical angle. So you chose us. What? A deliberate deception? It was a deliberate choice, Sarah admitted. I researched families for months. I chose you because you had the resources to provide every possible advantage for your child, but perhaps not the time to provide the direct, moment-to-moment engagement that is so critical in these early years. I wanted to prove a hypothesis, that the right kind of focused, respectful, play-based pedagogy could have a transformative effect, regardless of the socioeconomic environment. In a way, Lily was the perfect case study. The clinical nature of her explanation struck Eleanor like a physical blow. A case study? My daughter was an experiment to you? No, Sarah said, her voice softening with genuine empathy. She was a child I wanted to help reach her full potential. And she has. You've seen it yourself. She then looked from Eleanor to Richard, her gaze direct and unflinching. And yes, part of this study was the environment itself. The assumptions you made about me, the way your family members treated me, it was all data. The memory of the garden party, of Wallace's sneering face, of her own misplaced anger flooded Eleanor's mind. The shame was suffocating. You let us treat you like that, she whispered, horrified. You let my brother-in-law humiliate you. My ego was not the point of the exercise, Mrs. Vanderbilt, Sarah said quietly. What I felt was irrelevant. What Lily saw and how she reacted was everything. Her decision to stand up for me was a more successful outcome than any academic paper I could ever publish. Richard, seeing the conversation veering into the messy territory of feelings and ethics, tried to wrestle it back to familiar ground. Money. All right, he said, clearing his throat and adopting a magnanimous tone. Clearly there has been a misunderstanding of your value. We are prepared to rectify that. We will draw up a new contract, of course. Your salary will be commensurate with your qualifications. We can triple it. We can. I don't want a new contract, Mr. Vanderbilt, Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting through his offer with quiet authority. What? He asked, genuinely thrown. My staying here has nothing to do with my salary, she said, and now she stood as their equal, no longer the employee but the expert setting her terms. I will only continue to work with Lily under a new set of conditions. And they are not financial. She looked at them both, her expression serious. I will stay if you agree to become my partners. Not my employers, my partners. I will stay if you will sit on the floor with me and learn how to play with your daughter. I will stay if you read the books on my desk, if you learn the why behind the what we do every day. I will stay if you are willing to do the work to change the environment she is growing up in, so that she doesn't have to be the only one in the room brave enough to call out injustice. She let her terms settle in the profound silence of the room. My price is not more money. It's your participation. So, the question isn't what you're prepared to pay me. The question is what you are prepared to do. She had taken all their power and handed it back to them in the form of a choice. They were no longer in control of their employee, they were now responsible for their own education. Richard sat behind his desk for once in his life, utterly speechless. Eleanor stared at the woman before her, the woman she had hired, dismissed, investigated, and feared. And she finally understood. The reckoning was not about Sarah's deception. It was about their own. 1 year later, the Vanderbilt mansion was, in essence, a different house. The physical structure of brick and ivy remained, but the atmosphere within its walls had been fundamentally rebuilt. The hushed, museum-like quality was gone, replaced by the vibrant, chaotic, and joyful echoes of a home where a child was truly allowed to live. The polished marble floors were often smudged with finger paint, and the priceless silence was frequently broken by peals of laughter. The most profound change, however, was in its architects. Richard and Eleanor Vanderbilt had accepted Sarah's terms, not with the grudging reluctance of a defeated party, but with the slow dawning humility of students who realized they had everything to learn. A visitor arriving on a Saturday afternoon would not have found Richard in his study or Eleanor planning a gala. They would have found them in the playroom, now renamed the lab, sitting on the floor. Richard, in a cashmere sweater now dusted with flour, was meticulously helping Lily construct a working volcano from baking soda and vinegar. He wasn't just observing, he was explaining the chemical reaction in simple terms, his voice filled with a genuine wonder he hadn't felt since his first hostile takeover. He had discovered that the principles of building a business empire were surprisingly applicable to scaffolding a child's understanding of science. Eleanor, her hair in a messy bun and a smudge of blue paint on her cheek, was on the other side of the room, working with Sarah to create a large-scale mural of the solar system on a roll of butcher paper. She, who once saw her daughter as a beautiful accessory, now saw her as a universe of exploding novas and nascent constellations. She had traded her philanthropic board meetings for parent-teacher conferences, not as a duty, but as a source of genuine pride. She had learned the language of her daughter's world, and in doing so had found her own voice. The books from Sarah's room had migrated, now occupying a place of honor on the Vanderbilts' own nightstands, their pages dog-eared and highlighted. The couple's evening conversations were no longer about stock prices and social calendars, but about Vygotsky's zone of proximal development and the nuances of intrinsic motivation. They were, as Sarah had demanded, partners. The true test of their transformation came, as it often does, in the form of family. Wallace and Patricia were invited for brunch, an occasion Eleanor had once dreaded but now faced with a calm resolve. They arrived, their condescension still palpable, their gazes still critical. They found the family in the garden, not observing the prize-winning roses, but digging in a newly constructed vegetable patch. Lily, her hands caked in mud, ran up to them. "Look," she exclaimed, holding up a wriggling earthworm. "This is Lumbricus terrestris. They're detritivores. They help make the soil healthy for our carrots." Patricia recoiled with a delicate shudder. Wallace let out his signature booming laugh. "Good God, Richard, what's all this? Playing peasant for the day?" He glanced over at Sarah, who was helping Lily gently return the worm to the soil. "Still got the professor here filling the girl's head with dirt and $10 words, I see." Before Sarah could even register the comment, Richard stood up, wiping his muddy hands on his trousers. He looked his brother squarely in the eye, his expression devoid of its old defensiveness. "Her name is Dr. Adebayo, Wallace," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unshakable weight. "And yes, she is teaching my daughter about the foundations of life. It's a subject I found I know far too little about." Eleanor came and stood beside him, placing a hand on Lily's shoulder. She smiled at Patricia, a smile that was no longer brittle but warm and genuine. "We've discovered it's far more rewarding to cultivate a garden than a guest list, Patricia. You should try it sometime. It's wonderful for the soul." The rebuke was gentle but absolute. It was a united front, a seamless defense built not of anger, but of a newfound, unshakable confidence in their values. Wallace and Patricia were left speechless, their brand of casual cruelty rendered utterly impotent. They were the relics now, the ghosts of a past the Vanderbilts had left behind. Later that evening, after Lily was asleep, the three adults sat on the terrace, the scent of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine filling the air. For a long time they were silent, watching the fireflies begin their nightly ballet. "My contract was for 1 year," Sarah said softly, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact. Eleanor's heart clenched. She looked at Richard, who seemed equally stricken. The thought of the house without Sarah's quiet, guiding presence was unimaginable. "We were hoping," Eleanor began, her voice thick with emotion, "that you might consider this your home. Not as an employee. As family." Richard nodded, his expression earnest. "We're still learning, Sarah. We need you. Lily needs you." Sarah looked out at the sprawling, manicured lawn, at the distant lights of the city. She had come here with a hypothesis, a research question. She had intended to write a paper, perhaps a book, on her findings. But the data she had collected was not something that could be quantified in charts or published in journals. It was the look in Richard's eyes when Lily finally understood a concept. It was the sound of Eleanor's genuine, uninhibited laughter. It was the feeling of a little hand slipping trustingly into her own. Her case study had become a community. Her subject had become her family. "I believe," Dr. Sarah Adebayo said, turning to them with a smile that was luminous in the twilight, "that the most critical phase of our work together is just beginning. The quiet revolution was over. What had begun as a calculated infiltration had blossomed into a radical act of love. The Vanderbilts had learned that their greatest asset was not the name they had inherited or the fortune they had amassed, but the capacity to change. And in the heart of their magnificent house, under the gentle tutelage of a woman they had once looked down upon, they had finally truly started to build a home." Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video.